The blood appeared in Isolde's mirror 3 nights before she found the child. Not a trick of shadow or candlelight. Genuine crimson that wept down the silvered glass in her inherited bedchamber, pooling at the mirror's gilt frame before vanishing with the dawn. The servants whispered it was the Blackthorn curse, that old madness that had claimed her aunt's mind, and left Isolde this crumbling Victorian estate on the moors of Ashford Vale. But Isolde knew madness. She had nursed her mother through fever dreams that turned violent, had watched rationality dissolve like sugar in rain. This was different. The blood in the mirror felt like a summons. On the 3rd night, she pressed her palm to the glass. It was cold, impossibly cold, as though winter itself lived behind the reflection. Her breath fogged against the surface, and in that brief mist, she saw it a corridor of stone, lit by torches that burned with blue flame. A child's cry echoed from somewhere deep within that impossible space, thin and terrified. Isolde jerked her hand back, heart hammering against her ribs. "Miss Ashford." The housekeeper's voice drifted through the locked door. "Are you well?" "Perfectly well, Mrs. Headley." The lie tasted bitter. Nothing about Blackthorn Manor was well. Not the portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her through dim hallways. Not the library filled with books written in languages she couldn't identify. Not the locked eastern wing her aunt's solicitor had specifically forbidden her to enter. And certainly not the blood that wept from mirrors at midnight. Sleep proved elusive. Isolde wrapped herself in her deceased aunt's velvet dressing gown, too large, smelling faintly of dried roses and something darker, more metallic, and descended the main staircase. Moonlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting the marble floors in shades of crimson and violet. The house breathed around her, old timber settling. Wind moaning through chimneys like voices from another age. The child's cry came again. Not from the mirror this time, but from the eastern wing. Isolde's rational mind screamed warnings, but her feet carried her forward nonetheless. Past the gallery of stern-faced ancestors, past the morning room where her aunt had been found, collapsed over her escritoire with a pen still clutched in her rigid fingers. The eastern wing's entrance was barred by an iron gate, locked and forbidding. She should turn back, should return to her room, pack her trunks, flee to London before whatever haunted Blackthorn Manor claimed her as it had claimed her aunt. Instead, she noticed the gate stood slightly ajar. The corridor beyond stretched into darkness absolute. No moonlight penetrated here, no ambient glow from distant rooms. Only that blue, flamed darkness she'd glimpsed in the mirror, and the child sobbing, growing louder with each step she took into the forbidden wing. "Hello." Her voice emerged smaller than intended. "Is someone there?" The sobbing cut off abruptly. Isolde's hands trembled as she felt along the wall, searching for a door, a window, anything to orient herself in the consuming dark. Her fingers found carved stone instead of wallpaper, walls that belonged in a medieval crypt, not a Victorian manor house. Impossible, all of it impossible. Then her hand touched something warm, a child's hand, small and desperate, wrapping around her fingers with surprising strength. "Please," a voice whispered. "A little girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. Please don't let them take me back to the king. He'll lock me in the mirror realm again. He'll make me watch while..." "Cressida." The name cut through the darkness like a blade, spoken in a voice that made Isolde's blood run cold and her skin flush hot simultaneously. A voice of silk over stone, ancient and commanding, carrying centuries of authority and something that sounded terribly like grief. Light bloomed, not the warm glow of candles but that eerie blue luminescence. It revealed a chamber that couldn't possibly exist within Blackthorn Manor's walls, a vast space of Gothic architecture, all soaring arches and shadows, dominated by a throne of blackened wood and bone. And standing before that throne, between Isolde and the child who still gripped her hand, stood a man who stole the breath from her lungs. He was beautiful in the way winter was beautiful, deadly and elegant and absolutely inhuman. Hair dark as a raven's wing fell past his shoulders, framing a face carved from pale marble, all sharp cheekbones and a mouth that looked designed for both cruelty and pleasure. But his eyes arrested her, completely silver, bright and ancient. Holding the weight of countless lifetimes and unbearable sorrow, he wore black velvet and silver, the formal attire of nobility from an age-long past, and he moved with a predator's liquid grace as he approached. "You should not be here," he said, and Isolde heard the warning beneath his words. "Mortals who enter the court of shadows do not leave. My touch is death itself, and I have not spoken to a living soul in 300 years. Yet even as he spoke, something in those silver eyes called to her, recognition, perhaps, or the mirror of her own loneliness reflected back. The child squeezed her hand tighter, and Isolde, against all reason and self-preservation, did not let go. The vampire king did not move closer, and Isolde understood with sudden, visceral clarity that this was intentional. A deliberate maintenance of distance that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with survival. Her survival. I asked you a question, mortal. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, yet underneath ran a current of something else. Confusion, perhaps. Or wonder. How did you find the gate? The eastern wing has been sealed by blood magic for decades. The mirror. Isolde's voice caught. She forced steel into her spine. The same steel that had carried her through her mother's death and her own sudden inheritance. The mirror in my bedchamber. It showed me the way. It showed me her. She glanced down at the child, Cressida, he'd called her. The little girl was exquisite in a way that didn't belong to the mortal world, too perfect, too ethereal. With silver, blonde hair that seemed to hold its own luminescence and eyes the color of twilight. She wore a simple white dress that looked centuries out of fashion, and she trembled like a leaf in a storm. The mirror shouldn't have opened for you. The king's eyes narrowed, studying Isolde with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and strangely cherished. The Blackthorn bloodline was bound by covenant. They were to guard the threshold, not cross it. Your aunt understood this. She never once stepped through, not in 40 years of keeping vigil. My aunt went mad keeping vigil. The words emerged sharper than intended. I found her journals. Pages and pages of warnings, of blood rituals, of a child crying in the dark that she could hear but never help. She died trying to resist whatever called to her from this place. Something flickered across the king's beautiful, terrible face, guilt, perhaps, or a sorrow so profound it had calcified into stone over centuries. Eleanor. He spoke her aunt's name like a prayer or a curse. She was stronger than I deserved. But you. His gaze traced over Isolde again, and she felt that look like a physical touch, cold fire dancing across her skin. You shouldn't have been able to cross at all. The threshold kills mortals who attempt passage. It has killed every mortal who's tried, save the Blackthorn guardians who were protected by ancient compact. Yet here I stand. Isolde lifted her chin even as her knees threatened to betray her with their trembling. Alive. Yes. The single word held a universe of implications. Here you stand. Touching my daughter. Breathing the air of the shadow court. Immune to the very magic that should have reduced you to ash the moment you crossed the threshold. Daughter. The word resonated through Isolde's mind. This child was his daughter. Cressida has been lost to me for 3 years. The king continued, and now the grief in his voice cut like glass. Taken by rival covens who sought to leverage her against me, to force me back into the vampire politics I abandoned when... He stopped abruptly, jaw tightening. She escaped their blood prisons 2 nights ago. The mirror realm was meant to be sanctuary until I could secure her safety, but she's terrified of the shadows there. Understandably, Isolde felt the child press closer against her side, small body radiating cold instead of warmth. What do they want from her? She asked quietly. Why torture a child? Because I am Valerian Ashford, king of the Eternal Court. His name fell between them like a death knell. And my curse makes me untouchable, literally. Any mortal I touch withers and dies within heartbeats. Any vampire I touch loses their immortality, aging to dust in seconds. I have been alone for 3 centuries. Isolated by the very power that was meant to protect my throne. His silver eyes met hers with devastating honesty. My enemies know the only way to destroy me is through her. Through the one being in all the realms I can still touch without bringing death. Understanding dawned, cold and complete. You're Ashford. This manor was mine, yes. Before I was cursed, before I was transformed into this. He gestured to himself with something like disgust. Your family took the name when they accepted the guardianship covenant. Blackthorns who became Ashfords, bound to guard the threshold between my court and the mortal world, to keep both sides safe from each other. The blue flames in their sconces flickered, casting dancing shadows across Gothic arches. Isolde could feel the wrongness of this place now, not evil, precisely, but other. A realm where different laws applied, where time moved differently, where the dead and undead held court in darkness. I should be afraid. She whispered. Yes, Valerian agreed. You should be fleeing. Running back through the gate before it seals again, before you're trapped here forever. The Shadow Court is no place for mortal life. But even as he spoke, he didn't move, didn't command her to leave. And Isolde understood, with the same bone, deep certainty that had pulled her through the mirror's summons, that he was lonely. Desperately, achingly lonely in a way that transcended mere solitude and approached existential anguish. 300 years without touch, without connection, with only a daughter he could embrace while all others withered at his fingertips. What if I stayed? The question emerged before wisdom could stop it. Just until dawn. Until you're certain Cressida is safe. Something dangerous flashed in Valerian's eyes, hope, perhaps, or hunger. Maybe both. You don't know what you're offering. The longer you remain, the harder it becomes to leave. The Shadow Court claims pieces of mortal souls like interest on a debt. Stay too long, and you'll fade into the twilight realm yourself, becoming neither living nor dead, a ghost bound to these halls forever. Isolde looked down at Cressida, at the child's desperate grip on her hand, at the tear tracks on two pale cheeks. Then back up at the cursed king who stood so carefully apart, maintaining his killing distance with the precision of centuries of practice. Then we'd better work quickly, she said, and watched Valerian's controlled expression crack, just slightly, revealing the man beneath the monster. Valerian led them deeper into the Shadow Court with the careful precision of a man navigating a minefield, which Isolde realized he was. Every movement calculated to maintain distance. Every gesture designed to keep at least 3 feet between his body and hers. The child between them served as buffer and bridge simultaneously. The court exists in layers, Valerian explained as they traversed corridors of impossible architecture, staircases that spiraled upward and downward simultaneously, doorways that opened onto star-filled voids, mirrors that reflected scenes from centuries past. The threshold chamber where you entered is the outermost ring. Each layer deeper pulls you further from the mortal world, deeper into shadow, and deeper into your curse, Isolde observed, his silver eyes cut to her surprised. Yes. The heart of the court is the heart of my curse. That's where I was transformed, where the blood ritual bound me to eternal isolation. It's also where Cressida will be safest. My enemies cannot penetrate that far without losing themselves to shadow entirely. They emerged into a vast hall that stole Isolde's breath. Gothic columns soared into darkness above, carved with intertwining roses and thorns that seemed to move in the blue firelight. A massive table dominated the center, set for a feast that would never be eaten. Silver platters tarnished with age, crystal goblets filled with wine that had long since turned to vapor, white roses in centerpieces that had petrified into something between flower and stone. The last banquet, Valerian said quietly. 300 years ago, the night I was cursed. Isolde moved closer to the table, drawn by morbid fascination. The place settings were marked with names engraved on silver: Lord Cassius of the Northern Territories, Lady Evangeline of the Moonlit Gardens, Sir Thaddeus of the Blood Court, and at the head of the table King Valerian Ashford, eternal sovereign. What happened? She asked. Valerian's jaw tightened. A coup disguised as celebration. My most trusted advisors, jealous of my power, worked with a blood witch to curse me during the toast. They believed the curse would kill me, that my own deadly touch would turn inward, consuming me from within. Instead, it made me unkillable, untouchable, alone. He moved to one of the chairs, but didn't sit, couldn't, Isolde realized, because the wood itself might splinter under his cursed touch. They died anyway. The curse rebounded through the blood magic they'd used, aging them all to dust within minutes. I watched them crumble screaming while I remained pristine. Powerful. Damned. Cressida tugged on Isolde's hand, drawing her attention downward. The child pointed to a smaller door, barely visible in the shadows between columns. Papa's study, she whispered. That's where the prophecy book is. The one about the Thornblood. Valerian's entire body went rigid. Cressida, I told you never to speak of. But she is Thornblood, Papa. I can smell it on her. Roses and iron, just like the book says. The child's twilight eyes were wide earnest. She walked through the threshold. She can touch you without dying. The prophecy said one would come, and she's here. The temperature in the hall dropped precipitously. Frost crept across the petrified roses, across the tarnished silver. Valerian's silver eyes had gone cold and distant, the expression of a king rather than a father or a man. There is no prophecy, he said flatly, only desperate hope written by desperate fools. The Thornblood legend is fantasy, a story about a mortal bloodline immune to vampire curses, capable of breaking the bonds that imprison immortal kings. It's been chased by every cursed vampire for 1,000 years, and it has never, not once, proven true. But even as he spoke, Isolde felt something shift in her awareness, a recognition that lived deeper than conscious thought. The blood in the mirror, the ease with which she'd crossed the threshold, the way Valerian's presence called to something in her marrow, made her skin hum with an energy she didn't understand. How would you know? She challenged. If you've been isolated for 3 centuries, how would you know if a Thornblood approached? You'd turn them away before they could prove themselves, wouldn't you? Too afraid to hope after so much disappointment. Valerian moved then, not toward her but to the window, one of the great arched apertures that looked out onto gardens drowned in eternal moonlight. Hope is more dangerous than despair, he said to the glass. Despair I've learned to carry. Hope would destroy me. Isolde released Cressida's hand, earning a small sound of protest from the child, and moved closer to the king who stood so carefully alone, not close enough to touch, but close enough that he could feel her presence, her warmth, her mortal heat in this realm of eternal cold. What if it's real? She asked softly. What if I am what your daughter says? Would you waste the chance because you're afraid? Afraid? He turned, and the look in his eyes was devastating. Ancient pain and longing and a hunger that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with touch, with connection, with the simple human contact he'd been denied for longer than empires endured. I am terrified. Because if you are Thornblood, if you can somehow withstand my curse, then for the first time in 300 years I would have something to lose again. Someone who could be used against me, hurt because of me, destroyed by my enemies simply for having the audacity to care. His gaze dropped to where Cressida stood, watching them both with those 2 knowing twilight eyes. They've already taken my daughter once. Tortured her in blood prisons to force my hand. If they learned there was a mortal who could touch me, who could break my isolation. He stopped, jaw working. They would do worse than kill you. Death would be a mercy compared to what vampire courts do to leverage points. Isolde stepped closer. One more step. Close enough now that she could see the individual threads of silver embroidery on his velvet coat. Count the shadows beneath his cheekbones. Watch his chest rise and fall with breath he didn't technically need. Then we'd better make certain they never find out, she whispered. And slowly, deliberately, she reached out her hand, time suspended in the heartbeat before contact. Valerian's silver eyes widened, genuine fear flashing across features that had worn only cold control for centuries. Don't. But Isolde's fingertips had already brushed against his hand. The world shattered. Not physically, the shadow court remained intact around them, its Gothic columns still soaring into darkness, its petrified roses still frozen mid-bloom. But something fundamental shifted, like reality itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. Isolde gasped as sensation flooded through the point of contact. Not the withering death Valerian had warned of, but something else entirely. Cold fire raced up her arm, exquisite and overwhelming, carrying with it fragments of emotion that weren't hers 3 centuries of isolation. The ache of untouchable loneliness, the desperate hunger for connection that had calcified into permanent grief. And underneath it all, a shocked recognition that resonated through every cell of her body. Mine, something ancient whispered in her blood. Always mine. Valerian jerked back as though burned, breaking contact. But the damage, or the miracle, was already done. He stared at his hand, then at her, disbelief warring with something that looked dangerously like hope on his impossibly beautiful face. You're alive, he breathed. How are you alive? Isolde's hand trembled, still tingling from the contact. Her skin glowed faintly where they'd touched. A luminescence that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. I don't know. I felt you, Valerian. I felt 300 years of your curse pour through me, but it didn't consume me. It recognized me. Thornblood. Cressida's voice rang with vindication and childish delight. I told you, Papa! She's the one from the prophecy? But Valerian had gone still, retreating into that kingly coldness that served as armor against hope. One touch proves nothing. The curse works in stages, first the cold, then the withering, then the death. Perhaps it simply hasn't progressed yet. Perhaps in moments you'll collapse, and I'll have killed another person through my own desperate stupidity. I won't. Isolde didn't know how she knew, but the certainty lived bone deep. Touch me again. Prove to yourself I'm not dying. Absolutely not. His voice was granite. I won't risk. You'll have to touch me eventually if we're to protect Cressida. Isolde gestured to the child, who watched them with those eerily perceptive twilight eyes. You said your enemies will come for her. You said the only safety is deeper in the court, at the heart of your curse. But she's a child, Valerian. She's terrified of the shadows. She'll need comfort, reassurance, someone to hold her hand through the dark places you must take her. You don't understand what you're asking. But his resistance was crumbling. She could hear it in his voice. The deeper layers of the court aren't like this. Time moves differently there. Reality fractures. Mortals who venture too far lose themselves. Their memories dissolve, their identities scatter across shadow, until they become nothing but echoes trapped in twilight. Then you'll anchor me. Isolde held out both hands now, palms up, an offering and a challenge. Touch me again. Hold my hands. Prove that the curse recognizes what I am, and that I can withstand what others cannot. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Blue flames flickered in their sconces. Somewhere in the impossible distance, bells chimed, not mortal bells marking earthly hours. But something else, some otherworldly timekeeper counting moments that didn't exist in the world above. Valerian's gaze dropped to her offered hands. She watched emotions war across his face, fear and longing, hope and despair, the careful control of centuries cracking under the weight of possibility. If you die, he said quietly, if this kills you, I will never forgive myself. Not in all the eternities I have left to endure. Then we'd better discover I don't die. Isolde smiled, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Touch me, your majesty. Let's break your curse together. He moved like a man approaching his own execution, slow, deliberate. Every step weighted with 300 years of caution. When he stood before her, close enough that she could feel the supernatural cold radiating from his body, he paused one final time. Isolde Ashford, he said formally, I, Valerian, king of the Eternal Court, give you this warning: what passes between us in this touch may bind you to me in ways neither of us understand. The prophecy speaks of blood recognition, of souls intertwined across lifetimes. If you are truly Thornblood, this will not be simple immunity. It will be connection. I understand. No, he said softly, you don't, but you will. Then his hands closed over hers. The world exploded into sensation. This time with full contact. The flood of shared emotion was overwhelming. Isolde felt herself falling into Valerian's consciousness, not replacing her own awareness, but merging with it. Like two rivers joining into one stronger current. She saw flashes of his past, a young nobleman accepting the dark gift of vampirism to save his dying kingdom. A king ruling with justice and mercy until jealousy poisoned his court. The moment of betrayal, wine laced with blood magic. The curse taking hold as his trusted advisors crumbled to dust around him, and she felt his present the bone, deep ache of isolation. The way he'd learned to carry loneliness like a second skin, the fierce protective love for his daughter warring with terror that he would fail her again. But underneath it all ran something else, a golden thread of recognition that sang through her blackthorn blood, through whatever made her Thornblood, through the very essence of who she was. Soul bond, whispered that ancient voice in her marrow. The prophecy's truth. Valerian's eyes had gone wide, silver bright as stars. You see it too, he said, not a question. The binding, yes. Her voice emerged shaky, I see it. His hands tightened on hers. The first deliberate touch he'd chosen in 3 centuries. Then God help us both, he whispered. Because I don't think I can let you go now. Cressida clapped her hands together, delighted. Can we go to the inner sanctum now? I want to show Isolde the rose gardens where you used to take Mama, before. She stopped abruptly, twilight eyes going huge. Papa, she whispered, fear bleeding into her voice. They've found the threshold. The hunters are here. The hunter's arrival announced itself through the shadow court like a discordant note in a symphony. Wrong, violent, tearing at the fabric of the realm itself. Valerian released Isolde's hands, though she felt the breaking of contact like a physical wound. His entire demeanor transformed in an instant. The vulnerable man who'd finally allowed himself to hope vanished beneath the cold authority of an immortal king who had ruled for centuries before his curse. Cressida, to me, his voice carried absolute command. Stay behind me. Do not leave my shadow no matter what you see. The child obeyed instantly, pressing herself against her father's legs. Valerian's hand hovered over her head, protective, but still not quite touching, maintaining that careful distance even now. How many? He asked, gaze fixed on the distant threshold chamber. 5. Cressida's voice trembled. I can feel their silver. It burns even from here. Isolde's mind reeled. Silver. I thought vampires were myth, or at least, I thought they followed the old stories. Stakes and sunlight and mythology written by mortals who never understood what they feared. Valerian moved toward the great hall's entrance, supernatural grace lending him the appearance of floating rather than walking. Silver doesn't kill vampires, it binds us. Chains forged from blessed silver can trap even the most ancient of our kind, force us into dormancy while our captors do as they will with our helpless forms. Horror crawled up Isolde's spine. That's what they did to Cressida. For 3 years, his words came sharp as broken glass. 3 years of my daughter imprisoned in silver chains while rival covens used her blood for ritual magic, used her pain to send me messages, used her existence as leverage to draw me out of my sanctuary. They reached the threshold chamber, that vast space of Gothic arches where Isolde had first crossed from her bedchamber mirror. Now it seethed with wrongness. The blue flames guttered and sparked. The air itself seemed to tear in places, revealing glimpses of the mortal world, beyond moonlight on Blackthorn Manor's overgrown gardens, the gleam of drawn weapons, the glint of silver chains held in gloved hands. 5 figures stood at the gate between worlds, half manifested in the shadow court. They wore hunter's garb, dark leather and blessed symbols, faces hidden behind masks of hammered silver. But what made Isolde's blood run cold was the woman they held between them. Mrs. Headley, her housekeeper, bound in silver and clearly terrified. Release her. Isolde started forward, but Valerian's arm shot out, blocking her path, not touching, even now, even in crisis, maintaining that careful distance, but preventing her advance nonetheless. That's what they want, he said quietly. They've realized somehow that you crossed the threshold, that you're here with me. They're using your servant as bait. One of the hunters stepped forward, removing their mask to reveal a woman's face, beautiful in a cruel way, with eyes like chips of amber and hair the color of dried blood. King Valerian. Her voice dripped mockery. Still hiding in your cursed sanctuary, I see. 3 centuries, and you haven't changed except now you've acquired new pets. A mortal woman who can cross your threshold. How unprecedented. Lady Seraphine. Valerian's tone remained level, but Isolde heard the hatred underneath. I should have known the blood court would send you. Cruelty has always been your particular art. Seraphine smiled. And it was a terrible thing to witness. The blood court wants what it's always wanted, your return to vampire politics, your power brought back into the fold. We've been patient, Valerian. We returned your daughter to you. You tortured my daughter for 3 years. And now we've brought you a gift, a mortal who can apparently survive your touch. Seraphine's amber eyes fixed on Isolde with predatory interest. Thornblood, perhaps. How delicious. The blood court would very much like to study her. See what makes her so special. What her blood might offer us. Mrs. Headley whimpered, silver chains tightening around her throat. Let the servant go, Valerian commanded. Your quarrel is with me, not defenseless mortals. Is she defenseless? Seraphine cocked her head. She served the Blackthorn Guardian for 40 years. She knows the threshold's secrets. And she might know what makes your little mortal friend so uniquely immune to your curse. She drew a silver blade from her belt. Tell us, housekeeper. What is Isolde Ashford? What blood flows in her veins? I don't know. Mrs. Headley's voice cracked with terror. I swear, I don't know anything. Miss Ashford only arrived 3 days ago. I never even met her before. The blade pressed against the housekeeper's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. Stop. Isolde lunged forward again, but this time Valerian caught her. Actually caught her, his hand wrapping around her wrist with desperate strength. The touch sent that cold fire racing through her nerves again, but he held on, anchoring them both. Don't, he said urgently. The moment you cross back through the threshold, they'll take you. Chain you, use you against me just as they used Cressida. But Mrs. Headley is already dead if we don't play this carefully. His silver eyes met hers with terrible honesty. The blood court doesn't leave witnesses. They're using her to draw you out, and once they have you, they'll kill her anyway. Seraphine laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Oh, this is delightful. The cursed king has finally found something he cares about besides his daughter. How the mighty have fallen, brought low by a mortal girl with unusual blood. She twisted the knife, and Mrs. Headley screamed. Isolde felt something break open inside her, not panic but fury. Cold, clear, absolute rage at the cruelty on display. Her free hand clenched into a fist, and she felt that strange luminescence pulse beneath her skin. The same glow that had appeared when she first touched Valerian. What are your terms? She demanded. What do you want in exchange for her life? Valerian's grip on her wrist tightened almost painfully. Isolde, no, but Seraphine's smile widened. Smart girl, we want simple things. Your blood, freely given. 3 vials, taken under ritual conditions. We want to understand what makes Thornblood immune to royal curses. And we want you to walk back through that threshold and submit to silver binding while we conduct our research. And if I agree, the servant goes free. You have my word as a blood court representative. The word of a torturer. Valerian spat. Worth less than ash. But Isolde was already calculating. weighing choices with the same pragmatic determination that had carried her through her mother's death and her aunt's mysterious legacy. Mrs. Headley was innocent, and Isolde had already crossed one threshold tonight. What was one more? "I'll do it," she said. "But Valerian and Cressida remain untouched. You get me, and you leave them alone." "Isolde, don't be a fool." She turned to face the cursed king, this impossibly beautiful immortal who had touched her twice now and broken 3 centuries of isolation. "You said it yourself. The longer I stay in the Shadow Court, the harder it is to leave. My soul is already beginning to fray at the edges. I can feel it. At least this way, Mrs. Headley lives and you and Cressida stay safe." His face was anguish incarnate. "They'll kill you once they have what they want. Maybe." She smiled, surprised by her own calm. "Or maybe Thornblood is harder to kill than they expect." And before he could stop her, Isolde pulled free of his grasp and walked toward the threshold, toward the waiting hunters and their silver chains. The silver chains burned, not with heat, but with a cold so profound it felt like fire. Blessed metal searing against skin that carried the mark of Thornblood, reacting to whatever ancient magic flowed through Isolde's veins. She gasped as the hunters clamped the manacles around her wrists, felt the metal sink into her flesh with supernatural hunger. Behind her, still trapped on the Shadow Court side of the threshold, Valerian made a sound like a wounded animal. "Let the housekeeper go." Isolde gritted out through the pain. Mu had an agreement. Seraphine studied her with those terrible amber eyes, then casually released Mrs. Headley with a shove that sent the older woman sprawling onto Blackthorn Manor's marble floors. "Run along, mortal. Forget what you've seen here, or the Blood Court will ensure you forget everything permanently." Mrs. Headley didn't need to be told twice. She fled, her footsteps echoing through the manor's halls until distance swallowed the sound. Now Isolde stood alone between worlds, mortal hunters at her back, an immortal king before her, separated by the threshold he could not cross without abandoning his daughter to the court's dangerous depths. Fascinating. Seraphine circled Isolde like a predator examining prey. "The silver accepts you, but slowly. Most mortals would be unconscious by now, their life force drained by blessed metal. But you're fighting it. What are you, Isolde Ashford? Someone who's going to make you regret this." Isolde managed, though darkness crept at the edges of her vision. Seraphine laughed. Bold words from a chained woman. "But let's test that boldness, shall we? I want to see what happens when Thornblood bleeds." She drew her silver blade again, the same knife that had threatened Mrs. Headley, and before Isolde could react, drew it across her palm. Blood welled immediately, crimson and bright, dripping onto the threshold between the Shadow Court and the mortal world. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The blood hit the threshold and ignited, not with flame, but with light, pure, searing radiance that exploded outward from the point of contact. The hunters screamed, stumbling back from the brilliance. The threshold itself began to crack, reality fracturing like glass under impossible pressure, and Valerian's curse shattered. Isolde felt it through the soul, bond they'd forged, felt the moment 300 years of dark magic unraveled like thread pulled from a tapestry. The deadly touch that had kept him isolated, the power that turned mortals to withered husks and vampires to dust, simply ceased to exist. He staggered, silver eyes wide with shock and something that looked like terror. "No," he breathed. "No, this isn't. The prophecy said breaking the curse would require willing sacrifice, a blood price paid in love and..." His gaze snapped to Isolde, to the blood still dripping from her palm. "What have you done?" But Isolde couldn't answer. The world tilted sideways as the silver chains drank deeper, as her blood continued to pour onto the threshold, as some ancient magic older than vampire courts or mortal kingdoms worked itself through her willing sacrifice. She saw visions, fragments of past and future colliding, a woman who looked like her, centuries ago, standing beside a vampire king who was not yet cursed, their hands joined in blood covenant. The betrayal at the banquet, the blood witch's curse, but underneath it a deeper magic, a failsafe woven into the spell itself, a prophecy embedded in the very curse that doomed Valerian. Only Thornblood freely given can break what Thornblood magic made, an ancient voice whispered through time. Only love willingly sacrificed can undo betrayal's price. Isolde's knees buckled. She would have fallen, but suddenly Valerian was there. He'd crossed the threshold, abandoned caution and 3 centuries of careful distance, to catch her before she hit the ground. His arms wrapped around her, and for the first time since his curse, he held another being without bringing death. "You foolish, brave, impossible woman," he said against her hair, voice breaking. You've undone 300 years of isolation, but at what cost? The silver is killing you. Your blood is everywhere. I don't know how to. The chains, Isolde whispered. Break them. You can touch them now, can't you? Without the curse, you can touch anything. Understanding dawned in his silver eyes. He grabbed the chains with both hands, blessed silver that should have burned even an ancient vampire, but now simply yielded to his grip. With supernatural strength and 3 centuries of rage, Valerian tore the manacles apart. The moment the silver broke, Isolde gasped as life rushed back into her body. The draining sensation ceased, though weakness remained. Her bleeding palm pulsed with pain, but she was alive, conscious, whole, and Valerian was touching her. Actually touching her, arms around her waist, her body pressed against his chest, his face buried in her hair as though he could anchor himself to her mortal warmth after an eternity of cold isolation. Papa! Cressida's voice rang from the shadow court side. The threshold's closing. If you don't come back now, you'll be trapped in the mortal world. Seraphine and the other hunters had recovered from the light's explosion. They circled now, silver weapons drawn, faces twisted with fury at having their prize escape. Kill them, Seraphine hissed. Kill them both. The blood court will not be denied, but Valerian lifted his head, and the look in his eyes was that of a king who had ruled justly for centuries before treachery had stolen his throne. You forget, Lady Seraphine, what I was before the curse. What I am again now that chains no longer bind my power. He stood, pulling Isolde up with him, keeping one arm protectively around her waist. With his free hand, he made a gesture simple, elegant, devastatingly powerful. The hunters froze mid-attack, held in place by invisible force. The curse didn't just make me untouchable, Valerian said quietly. It contained my true power, locked it away beneath the killing touch. But now, he flexed his fingers, and the hunter's silver weapons crumbled to dust. Now you face the king of the eternal court at full strength, and I am not pleased with how you've treated what is mine. His arm tightened around Isolde, claiming and protective simultaneously. Seraphine's eyes went wide with genuine fear. My lord, we were only following blood court orders. Then tell your blood court this Isolde Ashford is under my protection. Any who touch her will answer to me personally, and I have 300 years of isolation to repay in creative ways. His smile was beautiful and absolutely terrifying. Now run, before I decide mercy is wasted on torturers. They ran. Valerian turned to Isolde, and she saw the vampire king had vanished again, replaced by the man, vulnerable, grateful, and utterly devoted. Can you walk? The threshold is closing, and we must return to Cressida before. I can walk. Isolde leaned into his strength, marveling at the simple miracle of his touch. Take me home, Valerian. Take us both home. Together, they crossed back through the threshold, into the shadow court where Cressida waited. The gate sealed behind them with a sound like a sigh. And for the first time in 3 centuries, Valerian held 2 people in his arms without bringing death. The shadow court felt different now. Isolde noticed it immediately upon their return. The blue flames burned brighter, the Gothic columns seemed less oppressive. The eternal twilight had softened into something almost welcoming. As though the realm itself recognized that its king's curse had broken, that isolation no longer defined this place. Or perhaps it was simply her perception changing, filtered through the soul, bond that now thrummed between her and Valerian with every heartbeat. You're bleeding still. Cressida's small voice pulled Isolde's attention downward. The child stared at her wounded palm with concern far too mature for her apparent age. Papa, her blood is still everywhere. It's calling to the court, making the shadows hungry. Valerian's arm remained around Isolde's waist. He seemed unable or unwilling to release her, as though 3 centuries of enforced distance had created a desperate need for contact. The inner sanctum, he said decisively. We need to bind her wound properly, and the heart of the court has healing pools. Blood magic that predates even my reign. Can you walk that far? He looked down at Isolde with concern that made her heart clench. The silver drained you badly. I can carry you if I can walk. But even as she said it, her knees trembled. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind bone, deep exhaustion and the throbbing pain of her slashed palm. Valerian made a soft sound of frustration, then simply lifted her into his arms. The first time in 300 years he could carry someone, the gesture both practical and profound. Forgive my presumption, but you're about to collapse, and I've waited too long to touch another soul to watch you fall now. Isolde should have protested, should have insisted on her own strength, her independence. Instead, she let her head rest against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, winter roses and ancient stone, darkness given elegant form. The prophecy, she murmured as he carried her deeper into the court, Cressida trailing beside them like a pale shadow. I saw it when my blood touched the threshold. The visions showed me. Valerian, the blood witch who cursed you, she was Thornblood herself. Wasn't she? His stride faltered almost imperceptibly. How did you yes? Lady Morgana, my former advisor and the architect of my curse. She claimed to love me, wanted me to choose her as queen. When I refused, when I explained that kings of the eternal court cannot marry for love, but only for political alliance. He paused before a massive iron door carved with intertwining roses and thorns. She worked the curse through her own Thornblood magic. Made it so only another of her bloodline could break what she had made. She wanted you to suffer until someone like her came along. Understanding bloomed cold in Isolde's chest. A failsafe. If you ever found another Thornblood, another woman you might care for enough to let close despite the danger, then the curse would break, but only through blood sacrifice and willing love. The door opened at Valerian's touch, revealing a chamber that stole Isolde's breath despite her exhaustion. They had entered the true heart of the Shadow Court, a cathedral, like space where Gothic architecture transcended into something almost divine. Stained glass windows depicted scenes from vampire history in jewel tones that caught the blue firelight. At the center of the vast chamber, a pool of midnight, dark water reflected stars that didn't exist in any mortal sky. The blood pool. Valerian said softly, where vampire kings are crowned, where blood oaths are sealed, where the most ancient magic of our kind still flows. He carried Isolde to the pool's edge and carefully set her down. Your wound needs to be properly sealed, but mortal bandages won't work. Not after your blood touched the threshold, not after it unraveled 3 centuries of curse. You're changed now, Isolde. Marked by the magic you've broken. He knelt before her, taking her injured hand in both of his with a reverence that made her throat tight. For the first time, she could see clearly what 300 years of curse had cost him, not just isolation, but the loss of simple human gestures. The ability to comfort with touch, to express affection through contact, to exist as a physical being among others. This will sting, he warned, then gently lowered her bleeding palm into the dark water. It did more than sting. It burned, but not with the same agonizing cold of silver chains. This was different, a heat that spoke of transformation rather than destruction. The water around her hand began to glow, crimson mixing with midnight, and Isolde gasped as sensation flooded through the soul, bond connecting her to Valerian. Memories that weren't hers cascaded through her awareness. Valerian as a young man, still mortal, standing in this very chamber as he accepted the dark gift of vampirism to save his kingdom from plague. His coronation as king, the weight of the crown both literal and metaphorical, as he took responsibility for thousands of immortal souls. Lady Morgana's face, beautiful and terrible, as she whispered the curse over poisoned wine. May you remain untouched until Thornblood freely given breaks what Thornblood betrayed made. 3 centuries of isolation. Of watching the world change through mirrors and shadows, of holding only his daughter while everyone else withered at his touch. But there were older memories too. Buried deeper in the blood magic of the pool, a woman who looked like Isolde standing beside a vampire lord who looked like Valerian, centuries before either of them existed. The original Thornblood covenant between mortal and immortal lines, an oath spoken in this very chamber. Blood to blood, soul to soul, across lifetimes we shall be known to each other. Isolde's eyes flew open. We're not the first, she breathed. The Thornblood and the Ashford line, they've been bound before. This has happened before. Valerian's silver eyes reflected her shock. The blood memory, you're seeing the covenant's origin. His hands tightened on hers. My ancestor and your ancestor made a pact in this chamber. That Thornblood would always recognize Ashford, that across generations and lifetimes, when the king needed salvation, Thornblood would answer. It's why your aunt felt compelled to guard the threshold, why your family took the Ashford name, why you, why I felt called here. Understanding crashed over her like a wave. Why the mirror showed me the way. Why your touch doesn't kill me. We're fulfilling an oath made centuries before either of us existed. Reincarnation. Cressida's voice was small, uncertain, like in the old stories. Not reincarnation. Valerian lifted Isolde's hand from the pool. The wound had sealed completely, leaving only a thin silver scar in the shape of a rose. Something deeper. Blood memory passed through generations, souls recognizing each other across time. The covenant doesn't reincarnate the same souls. It ensures compatible ones will always find each other when needed most. He pressed his lips to the scarred palm, a gesture of such tender reverence that Isolde felt tears prick her eyes. "You came to break my curse," he said against her skin. "But you've done so much more. You've returned touch to me, given me back the ability to hold my daughter without fear. And you've awakened something I thought 3 centuries had killed, the capacity to feel something beyond grief and guilt." "What do you feel?" Isolde whispered. His silver eyes met hers, and the emotion in them was devastating in its honesty. "Hope, terror, gratitude, and something that frightens me more than the curse ever did, the beginning of what might become love, if we survive long enough for it to grow." Thunder rumbled through the shadow court. Impossible thunder, given there was no sky here. Cressida's eyes went wide. "Papa," she said urgently, "the blood court isn't accepting your warning. They're gathering. I can feel the vampire lords assembling at the threshold. They're coming for both of you." The blood court arrived with the ceremony of ancient predators who knew their power was absolute. Valerian stood at the threshold chamber's entrance, Isolde beside him and Cressida protected between them. Through the fractured gateway between worlds, they could see the vampire lords assembling in Blackthorn Manor's grand hall, 7 of them, each representing one of the great covens that had ruled alongside Valerian before his curse. They were terrible in their beauty. Immortality had refined each of them into something beyond human, all sharp elegance and predatory grace. They wore the fashions of different eras, Victorian frock coats beside Renaissance doublets, Regency gowns flowing into medieval armor, as though time itself was merely suggestion to beings who had transcended its normal flow. King Valerian. The speaker was an ancient vampire with silver hair and eyes like black ice, Lord Cassius of the Northern Territories, one of the names Isolde had seen engraved on the cursed banquet table. "We heard rumors that your curse had broken. The blood court finds this concerning, Valerian repeated, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of a predator deciding whether to strike. An interesting choice of words, Cassius. Not joyful, or relieved, that I've been freed from 3 centuries of isolation. Concerning, a woman in a gown of deepest crimson stepped forward, Lady Evangeline of the Moonlit Gardens, her beauty sharp enough to cut. You were contained, Valerian. The curse kept your power locked away, made you irrelevant to vampire politics. But now," her gaze swept over him with calculating assessment, "now you're dangerous again. And the mortal woman who freed you represents an unknown variable. Thornblood has been legend for so long. To have it proven real, to have its power demonstrated so dramatically. You want to study her," Valerian said flatly. "Dissect what makes her immune to royal curses. Perhaps use her blood to break or create other magical bindings. Can you blame us?" Lord Thaddeus, wearing armor from the Crusades, spread his hands in mock reasonableness. "Thornblood could revolutionize vampire magic, and other curses. Create new forms of power. Your lover represents possibilities our kind has sought for millennia. She is not my lover." But even as Valerian spoke, his hand found Isolde's, fingers intertwining with casual intimacy that belied his words. "She is under my protection. That should be sufficient for the blood court." "Your protection?" Lady Seraphine had joined the assembled lords, her amber eyes still burning with humiliation from their earlier encounter. "You, who abandoned your throne 300 years ago. You, who let vampire politics descend into chaos while you hid in your cursed sanctuary. Why should your protection mean anything to us now?" Isolde felt Valerian tense beside her, felt rage pulse through their soul, bond like lightning. But before he could respond, she stepped forward, not releasing his hand, but moving to stand slightly ahead of him, placing herself between the cursed king and the assembled court. "Because," she said clearly, "I am Thornblood, and if you harm me, if you take me against my will, you'll never understand what I am or how my blood works. You'll simply have a corpse with unusual properties, useless for your experiments, useless for breaking curses, useless for anything except demonstrating your short-sightedness." The silence that followed was profound. Lord Cassius's black eyes fixed on her with new interest. "Bold words, mortal. But what makes you think you have leverage here? We are 7 of the most ancient vampires in existence. You are a woman barely out of her 20s with unusual blood and no understanding of the powers you've stumbled into. I have understanding enough." Isolde lifted her scarred palm, letting the rose-shaped mark catch the blue firelight. "My blood touched the blood pool. It carries the Covenant's memory now. I've seen how Thornblood magic works. Seen the oaths my ancestors made with Valerian's line. And I know something you've forgotten in your centuries of political scheming." "What's that?" Lady Evangeline's tone dripped condescension. That curses have two edges. Isolde's voice rang with conviction she barely understood but trusted absolutely. Valerian's curse was created by Thornblood magic. Lady Morgana's betrayal, her twisted love turned to vengeance. But the covenant that predates that curse, it was built on willing partnership, on mutual respect between mortal and immortal lines. That's why my freely given blood could break what Morgana's hatred made. Because consent matters in blood magic. Choice matters. She took a breath, feeling Valerian's support through their bond, feeling Cressida's small hand slip into her free one. If you force me, chain me, try to take what I won't give freely, the Thornblood magic will turn on you. Your experiments will fail. Your curses will backfire. Your power plays will unravel. She met each vampire lord's gaze in turn. But if you honor the old covenant, if you treat me as partner rather than prize, I might consider sharing what I've learned. On my terms, with my consent. Lord Thaddeus laughed, a sound like grinding stone. You would negotiate with the blood court, a mortal negotiating with immortals. Why not? Isolde smiled, channeling every ounce of steel her mother had taught her. Every bit of determination that had carried her through grief and inheritance and stepping through mirrors into impossible courts. I have something you want. That's the foundation of any negotiation. She's right. Valerian's voice was quiet but absolute. And more than that, she's claimed by blood covenant to the Ashford line, which means she's claimed by me. To take her is to declare war on the king of the eternal court. He paused, letting that sink in. I've been cursed and contained for 3 centuries. I am no longer either. Ask yourselves, is one mortal woman's blood worth facing my full power in battle? The vampire lords exchanged glances, silent communication passing between ancient beings who had ruled together for millennia. Finally, Lord Cassius spoke. You propose a formal audience, then. The mortal comes before the blood court as a recognized entity rather than a subject for study. I propose exactly that. Valerian's hand tightened on Isolde's. 3 days from now, in the Hall of Eternal Night, Isolde will present her terms for cooperation. The blood court will either accept or reject them. But she walks in freely and leaves freely, under covenant protection, and if we reject her terms, Lady Evangeline asked, then we remain at an impasse. Valerian's smile was cold as winter. And I take her somewhere the blood court cannot reach, deeper into shadow than even you ancient ones dare venture. Choose wisely. More silent communication. Then Lord Cassius inclined his head fractionally. 3 days. The Hall of Eternal Night. We will hear the Thornblood's terms. His black eyes fixed on Isolde. But understand, mortal. If your terms prove insulting, or your cooperation insufficient, covenant protection will not save you from our displeasure. Understood. Isolde kept her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. 3 days. The vampire lords began to fade, returning to whatever domains they ruled in the spaces between mortal world and shadow court. But Lady Seraphine lingered a moment longer. You've won a reprieve, not a victory, she said softly. The blood court's patience has limits. And Valerian, her amber eyes glittered with malice, enjoy your broken curse while you can. Some of us remember what you were like before isolation. Some of us remember why Morgana cursed you in the first place. Then she too vanished, leaving only the echo of her words. Cressida tugged on Isolde's hand. What did she mean, Papa? Why you were cursed? Valerian's expression had gone carefully blank. Old history, little one. Nothing that matters now. But Isolde felt the lie through their bond, felt the shame and guilt that pulsed beneath his controlled exterior. Valerian, she said quietly. What aren't you telling me? His silver eyes met hers, and she saw the weight of 3 centuries of secrets in their depths. The curse didn't just punish me for rejecting Morgana. He said finally. It punished me for the sins that made me worthy of cursing in the first place. Valerian led them to a place Isolde hadn't seen before, deeper still into the Shadow Court's heart, through corridors that seemed to breathe with living darkness until they emerged into a garden that existed in defiance of all natural law. Blood roses. Thousands of them, growing in impossible profusion despite the absence of sun or soil. They bloomed in shades of crimson so deep they were nearly black, their petals luminescent in the eternal twilight. The air hung thick with their scent, roses and copper, beauty and death intertwined. A fountain stood at the garden's center, its waters running red as wine or blood, feeding the supernatural blooms. Mama's garden, Cressida whispered, awe and sorrow mixing in her voice. Papa, you never brought me here after she. I know. Valerian's voice was rough. I couldn't, not without. He trailed off, then knelt before his daughter, actually touching her face, cupping her small cheek with a tenderness that 3 centuries of curse had denied him. Cressida, I need to speak with Isolde alone. Will you wait for us in the sanctuary chamber? The one with your toy soldiers and books. The child's twilight eyes were far too knowing. You're going to tell her about Mama? About what happened? Yes. She needs to know, Papa. If she's going to stand before the blood court, if she's going to be. Cressida glanced at Isolde, then back to her father. If she's going to be part of our family, she needs to know all of it. Isolde's heart clenched at the casual way the child said family, as though 3 days of knowing each other could forge bonds that defied the supernatural world's politics. But perhaps, through blood, covenant, and soul bonds, it could. Cressida kissed her father's cheek, another impossibility made possible by Isolde's sacrifice, then slipped away into shadow, leaving them alone in the garden of blood roses. Valerian stood slowly, moving to the crimson fountain. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply stared at the falling water as though it held answers to questions he couldn't ask. Her name was Eleonora, he finally said. Not your aunt, though I suspect your family took that name as tribute, passed it down through the Blackthorn line, my wife, Cressida's mother. The woman I destroyed through my own arrogance and ambition. Isolde moved to stand beside him, close but not touching, giving him space for confession. I was young when I became king, barely a century old, practically an infant by vampire standards, but I was powerful, charismatic, ruthless when necessary. The old king had no heir, and the covens chose me to unite them. His jaw tightened. I was so certain I knew best. So convinced that my vision for vampire society was the only correct path. I wanted to bring us out of the shadows, to find ways for vampire and mortal to coexist without predation. Noble goals. That doesn't sound like something worthy of cursing. Isolde ventured. The goals weren't the problem. The methods were. Valerian's hands clenched on the fountain's edge. I became tyrannical in my righteousness. Anyone who disagreed with my vision, even those with valid concerns, I crushed. Exiled them, stripped them of titles and territory, made examples of them. I told myself it was for the greater good, that a firm hand was necessary to guide vampire society into a better age. He turned to face her, and the anguish in his silver eyes was devastating. Lady Morgana was one of my advisors. She was brilliant, powerful, and she loved me. But she also saw what I was becoming, the tyrant hiding behind noble intentions. She tried to warn me, tried to make me see that I was destroying the very thing I claimed to want, a council of equals working together. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I dismissed her concerns, told her she was too emotional, too focused on personal feelings to see the political necessities. I was cruel in my dismissal. And Eleonora? Isolde asked gently. Eleonora was mortal, a scholar I met when she came to study vampire history, to write about our kind with accuracy rather than fear. She was brilliant, fearless, and she saw through my carefully constructed image to the insecure young king beneath. A smile ghosted across his face, bittersweet. She called me on my tyranny, made me laugh at my own pretensions. For a brief time, she made me a better ruler. He moved away from the fountain, walking among the blood roses with the careful grace of someone navigating a minefield of memory. We married in secret. A vampire king taking a mortal wife was scandalous enough, but doing so without the blood court's approval was political suicide. I thought I was being romantic, defying tradition for love. His laugh was bitter. I was being selfish, claiming what I wanted without consideration for the consequences she would face. The court found out. Isolde guessed. Morgana found out. She'd been in love with me for decades, waiting for me to notice, to choose her. When she learned I'd married a mortal in secret, Valerian stopped before a rose bush that bloomed larger and darker than the others. She was heartbroken, furious, and she had every right to be. I'd used her political support, valued her counsel, given her reason to hope, then discarded her for someone else without explanation or apology. He touched one of the dark roses, and Isolde saw his fingers tremble. The curse came during a banquet meant to celebrate my marriage. I'd finally announced Eleonora publicly, forced the court to accept her. Morgana worked her blood magic through the ceremonial wine. The curse was meant to kill me, but my power was too great. It adapted instead, twisting into something worsey. I would be untouchable, isolated, unable to hold even my wife without bringing her death. Tears slipped down Valerian's cheeks, the first she'd seen from him. Eleonora tried anyway. She knew the curse, understood what my touch would do, but she thought love would be stronger. She thought if she held me, if she refused to let go, the magic would break before her will did. Oh God! Isolde breathed, understanding dawning horrible and complete. She died in my arms, withered to ash while I screamed for her to let go, while I begged her to release me. But she wouldn't. She held on until the very end, whispering that she loved me, that it wasn't my fault. His voice broke, but it was my fault. All of it. My arrogance created the political situation. My cruelty to Morgana drove her to vengeance. My selfishness put Eleonora in danger. And my curse killed her while she tried to prove love was stronger than magic. He turned to Isolde, and the raw vulnerability in his expression made her heart break and heal simultaneously. Cressida was born 3 months after her mother's death. I'd turned Eleonora before our marriage, with her consent, so we could have eternity together. The transformation preserved her pregnancy, allowed our daughter to be born even after. He couldn't finish. So you see, Isolde. The curse wasn't just punishment for rejecting Morgana. It was justice for the tyrant I'd been, the lives I'd destroyed through my arrogant certainty that I alone knew what was right. Isolde stepped closer, closing the distance between them. And you've carried that guilt for 300 years. Isolated yourself not just because of the curse, but because you believed you deserved the isolation. Didn't I? The question was raw, honest. Everything Seraphine said was true. I was not a good king before the curse. I was not a good man. Morgana's vengeance was terrible, but my sins were real. Yes, Isolde said simply. Your sins were real. Your arrogance hurt people. Your tyranny drove a brilliant woman to such desperate fury that she cursed you. She took his hands, still marveling at the simple miracle that she could. But Valerian, you've paid that price. 300 years of isolation. 300 years of watching the world change while you remained frozen. 300 years of holding only your daughter while denying yourself every other comfort. She lifted his hands to her lips, kissing scarred knuckles that had known only cold for so long. At some point, penance has to end. At some point, you have to forgive yourself enough to move forward. Not to forget. Never to forget, but to learn to grow, to become the king you wanted to be rather than the tyrant you were. Valerian stared at her as though she'd performed a miracle greater than breaking his curse. How can you, after everything I've told you, how can you look at me like that, like I'm worthy of, off love? Isolde finished softly, because broken people can love too, Valerian. Because the man who spent 3 centuries in isolation rather than risk hurting others again is not the same man who was cursed. You've changed, you've learned, and yes, you'll have to prove that to the blood court in 3 days. But maybe, she smiled, tentative but real. Maybe you can start by proving it to yourself first. He pulled her close then, wrapping her in an embrace that was desperate and tender and 3 centuries overdue. His face buried in her hair, his body shaking with emotion too long suppressed. I don't deserve you, he whispered against her temple. Maybe not, Isolde agreed. But you have me anyway. That's how grace works. In the garden of blood roses, with crimson water singing its eternal song, the cursed king finally allowed himself to hope that redemption might be possible after all. 3 days passed in the shadow court like 3 heartbeats, or 3 lifetimes, depending on which layer of reality one occupied. Isolde spent them learning. Valerian taught her the intricate politics of vampire covens, the blood oaths that bound immortal society, the ancient laws that predated human civilization. Cressida showed her the court's hidden spaces, libraries filled with books written in languages that predated Latin, galleries displaying art from civilizations long turned to dust, chambers where time pooled like water and memories, played across walls like shadows cast by invisible flames, and in the quiet moments, stolen between lessons and preparations, Valerian touched her. Simple touches that meant everything, fingers brushing as they walked, his hand at the small of her back when guiding her through doorways, the press of his lips to her forehead when exhaustion made her sway. Each contact a small miracle, each embrace a revolution against 3 centuries of isolation. But now the 3 days had ended. The Hall of Eternal Night existed in a space between the Shadow Court and the mortal world, neutral ground where the great vampire covens gathered for matters of cosmic importance. Isolde stepped through the threshold on Valerian's arm, Cressida walking just behind them in a gown of twilight silk that made her look like a small goddess of dusk. The hall was vast beyond comprehension. Gothic architecture soared into darkness that never ended, columns carved from obsidian and moonstone supporting arches that defied geometry. 7 thrones circled a raised dais at the chamber's center, each representing one of the ancient covens. And on those thrones sat the vampire lords who would judge whether Isolde lived or died, whether her cooperation was accepted or her blood taken by force. Lord Cassius of the Northern Territories, Lady Evangeline of the Moonlit Gardens, Lord Thaddeus of the Blood Court, Lady Seraphine and 3 others Isolde hadn't met, Lord Ambrose of the Shadow Archives, Lady Cordelia of the Crimson Veil, and Sir Lysander of the Eternal Hunt, 7 immortals whose combined age exceeded 10,000 years, staring at her with eyes that had witnessed empires rise and fall. Isolde Ashford, called Thornblood. Lord Cassius's voice echoed through the impossible space. You stand before the assembled Blood Court to present terms for your cooperation. The court has granted you this audience under covenant protection, as negotiated by King Valerian. Speak. Isolde stepped forward, releasing Valerian's arm, though she felt his presence like an anchor at her back. She dressed carefully for this moment, not in the borrowed gowns Cressida had found for her, but in her own clothing from the mortal world. Simple, modern, mortal. A deliberate reminder of what she was and what they could never be. Lords and ladies of the Blood Court. She began, her voice steady despite the terror singing through her veins. You want to understand Thornblood magic. You want to know how my blood broke a curse that held for 3 centuries, how I survived silver chains that should have killed me, how I can touch a cursed king without withering. She paused, meeting each ancient gaze in turn. I'll tell you. But first I need you to understand what Thornblood actually is, because you've been misunderstanding it for a millennium. Lady Evangeline's expression sharpened. Bold claim, mortal. What makes you think you understand something we've studied for centuries? Because you've been studying it wrong. Isolde lifted her scarred palm, showing the rose-shaped mark. You think Thornblood is a genetic anomaly, a quirk of mortal bloodlines that makes us immune to vampire magic. But it's not immunity, it's resonance. She felt Valerian's surprise pulse through their bond, felt his attention focus completely on her words. The original covenant between Thornblood and vampire lines wasn't about protection from magic. It was about partnership with magic. My ancestors and Valerian's ancestors made an oath. That mortal and immortal would work together, that neither would dominate the other, that power would be shared rather than hoarded. She gestured to the assembled lords. That's why you can't force Thornblood magic to work. That's why your experiments always fail. Because the magic itself is built on consent, on willing cooperation, on mutual respect. Lord Thaddeus leaned forward, ancient eyes glittering. And you claim to understand this after 3 days in the Shadow Court, when we've studied for centuries. I claim to understand it because I felt it. Isolde's voice rang with conviction. When my blood touched the threshold, when it broke Valerian's curse, I experienced the blood memory, saw how the original oath was made, felt the intention woven into the magic itself. Thornblood doesn't make us immune to your power. It makes us capable of choosing to engage with your power on equal terms. Silence fell across the hall of eternal night. Finally, Lord Ambrose spoke, a vampire with silver, streaked hair and eyes like dying stars. If what you say is true, then Thornblood cooperation cannot be compelled. It can only be invited. Exactly. Isolde nodded. Which brings me to my terms. Terms. Lady Seraphine's voice dripped venom, a mortal dictating terms to the Blood Court. This grows tiresome. Nevertheless, she'll speak them. Valerian's voice cut through the tension like a blade. You agreed to hear her. Honor that agreement, Seraphine, or admit the Blood Court's word means nothing. Lady Cordelia, who hadn't spoken until now, raised a hand for silence. She was ancient even among immortals, wearing a gown from an era before Rome fell. Her beauty so refined it barely seemed real. Let the Thornblood speak her terms. We will deliberate. Isolde took a breath, channeling every ounce of courage she possessed. My terms are these first. I will share what I've learned about Thornblood magic, how it works, how it might be applied to other curses or magical bindings. But I do so as consultant. No experiments on my person, no forced blood extraction, no chains or compulsion. Agreed in principle. Lord Cassius said. Continue. Second, any vampire who wishes to work with Thornblood magic must first demonstrate they understand the principle of consent. You cannot take what must be given freely. This isn't negotiable. It's fundamental to how the magic functions. Lord Thaddeus scowled. You would require ancient vampires to prove themselves to a mortal. I would require anyone who wants to use covenant magic to respect the covenant's foundation. Isolde corrected. Vampire or mortal, ancient or young. The magic doesn't discriminate, and neither do I. Lady Evangeline exchanged glances with Lord Cassius. A reasonable requirement, given the magical constraints you've described. What else? Third, Isolde's voice strengthened. Valerian's exile ends. He is restored to his position as king of the Eternal Court, with full rights and privileges. Any vampire who attempts to harm him, Cressida or anyone under his protection answers to me directly. The hall erupted. Unacceptable. Lord Thaddeus was on his feet. The cursed king abandoned his throne 3 centuries ago. We've ruled without him, ruled poorly. Valerian interjected coldly. I've been watching Thaddeus, watching as the covens descended into petty territorial disputes, as vampire-mortal relations deteriorated, as everything I tried to build crumbled under short-sighted leadership more concerned with personal power than our kind's survival. You were tyrant. Lady Seraphine spat. Why should we welcome your return? Because, Isolde said quietly, drawing all attention back to her, is not the same king you cursed. 3 centuries of isolation taught him what no amount of ruling ever could: humility, patience, the cost of arrogance. And because, she met Seraphine's amber eyes directly, my cooperation is tied to his restoration. Harm him or exclude him, and Thornblood magic remains beyond your reach. Forever. The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Cordelia rose from her throne with the grace of ages. The mortal plays a dangerous game, binding her cooperation to the cursed king's restoration. Her dying star eyes swept over Isolde with something that might have been approval. But she plays it well. And her logic is sound. If Thornblood magic truly requires consent and partnership, then perhaps we need a king who has finally learned what those words mean. She turned to address the assembled court. I call for deliberation. The Blood Court will withdraw to consider these terms. Isolde Ashford, King Valerian, and the child Cressida will wait here under covenant protection until we return with our decision. One by one, the vampire lords vanished into shadow, leaving Isolde standing in the vast hall with only Valerian and Cressida beside her. Valerian's hand found hers, squeezing gently. That was either brilliant or suicidal. Possibly both. Definitely both. Isolde admitted, her legs finally beginning to shake with delayed terror. Did I just declare war on the Blood Court or negotiate peace? We're about to find out. The wait stretched into eternity, or perhaps only minutes. Time behaved strangely in the Hall of Eternal Night, measured not by mortal clocks but by the weight of ancient deliberations happening in spaces between shadow and substance. Cressida pressed close to Isolde's side, her small hand cold in Isolde's warm grasp. They're arguing, the child whispered. I can hear them in the blood currents. Lord Thaddeus wants to reject everything. Lady Seraphine wants to take you by force, covenant protection be damned. But the others... She tilted her head, listening to frequencies Isolde couldn't perceive. The others are considering. Valerian stood slightly apart, his posture that of a king awaiting judgment, spine straight, shoulders back, silver eyes fixed on the space where the vampire lords had vanished. But Isolde felt his tension through their soul bond, felt the 3 centuries of hope and fear coiling in his chest like serpents made of ice and fire. If they reject the terms, he said quietly, I won't let them take you. We'll flee deeper into shadow, to places even the Blood Court cannot follow. You'll be safe, even if it means abandoning your chance to rule again. Isolde finished what he couldn't say. Even if it means staying in exile forever. His jaw tightened. You're more important than a throne. Before Isolde could respond, the shadows rippled. The vampire lords returned, materializing on their thrones with the dramatic flair of beings who had mastered theatrical timing over millennia. Lady Cordelia stood, and the hall fell silent with the weight of her authority. She was eldest among them, her word carrying the force of ages. The Blood Court has deliberated, she announced, her voice echoing through impossible architecture. Isolde Ashford, called Thornblood, your terms have been heard and considered. We have reached our decision. Isolde's heart hammered against her ribs. Beside her, Valerian's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with desperate strength. Your first term. That you serve as consultant rather than subject. The court accepts. We acknowledge that forcing cooperation would be counterproductive, given the nature of covenant magic you've described. Lady Cordelia's gaze swept across the assembled lords. Lord Cassius, Lady Evangeline, and I voted in favor. Lord Thaddeus and Lady Seraphine opposed. Lord Ambrose and Sir Lysander abstained. The measure passes by majority. 1 down, 2 to go. Your second term. That those who wish to work with Thornblood magic must demonstrate understanding of consent. The court also accepts, with modifications. Lady Cordelia gestured to Lord Ambrose. The Shadow Archives will establish a protocol for such demonstrations. Any vampire who cannot prove they comprehend the principle of willing cooperation will be barred from covenant work. This term was unanimous. Isolde felt surprise pulse through Valerian's grip. Even Lady Seraphine had agreed to that one, which suggested the vampire lords understood, at least intellectually, that force would be futile. Your third term, however. Lady Cordelia's expression became unreadable. the restoration of King Valerian to his throne. This proved divisive. Isolde's stomach dropped. Lord Thaddeus and Lady Seraphine voted to reject outright. They maintain that the cursed king's abandonment of his duties, however justified by circumstance, disqualifies him from leadership. Sir Lysander voted in favor, citing Valerian's previous service and the lessons learned through isolation. Lord Ambrose voted in favor, noting that the court has lacked unified leadership for 3 centuries. Lady Evangeline, Cordelia paused, abstained, claiming conflicted interests. That left Lord Cassius and Lady Cordelia herself. 2 votes that would determine everything. Lord Cassius. Cordelia invited. The ancient vampire stood, black ice eyes fixing on Valerian with an intensity that could shatter stone. I remember the king you were, Valerian. I sat on your council when you turned tyrannical, when righteousness became rigidity and vision became vindictiveness. I watched you destroy alliances through arrogance, silence dissent through intimidation. I was there when Morgana cursed you, and I understood why she did it. Valerian's hand tightened on Isolde's until it was almost painful. But, Cassius continued, I have also watched the Shadow Court for 3 centuries. Watched you maintain this realm in perfect isolation, never once using your considerable power to force your way back into vampire politics. Watched you raise your daughter with gentleness despite your curse. Watched you honor the Blackthorn Guardians who protected your threshold, never compelling them to do more than their oath required. He paused. That is not the behavior of the tyrant I remember. That is the behavior of a king who learned, through terrible cost, what leadership truly means. He inclined his head fractionally. I vote in favor of restoration. With conditions. Hope blazed through Isolde's chest. All eyes turned to Lady Cordelia. The eldest vampire regarded them all with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall, empires bloom and wither. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of final judgment. I am oldest among us. I ruled before any of you were born, before vampires organized into courts and covens, when we were simply immortals trying to survive in a mortal world. I have seen kings rise and fall, watched power corrupt and isolate and destroy. She stepped down from her throne, moving with impossible grace to stand before Valerian. You were not a good king, Valerian Ashford. Your arrogance hurt people I cared for. Your certainty that you alone knew the right path caused suffering that reverberates still. She tilted her head, studying him. But you paid a price that would have broken lesser beings. 300 years of curse, of isolation, of touching only one soul in all the world, and you emerged not bitter, not vengeful, but humbled. She turned to Isolde. And you, mortal woman barely weeks into understanding what you are, you stood before the blood court and demanded not just your own protection, but his restoration. Not because he could offer you power or safety, but because you saw in him the potential for redemption. That is either foolishness or wisdom, so profound it appears as foolishness. Lady Cordelia returned to her throne, and when she spoke again, her words carried the force of law itself. I vote in favor of restoration. With Lord Cassius's conditions, which are these: Valerian Ashford returns as king of the Eternal Court, but with a council of equals rather than subordinates. Decisions affecting all vampire kind require majority agreement. And, her gaze sharpened, Isolde Ashford becomes official liaison between mortal Thornblood lines and vampire courts. She serves as check on royal power, ensuring the tyranny of the past does not resurface. Silence fell like snow. Then Lord Cassius spoke. The blood court has decided. By vote of 5-2, with 1 abstention, Isolde Ashford's terms are accepted in full. King Valerian is restored to the throne of the Eternal Court. The covenant between Thornblood and vampire is renewed. Let it be witnessed and bound in blood. The hall erupted in light, not the blue flames of the Shadow Court, but pure radiance that spoke of oaths sealed in magic binding. Isolde felt it wash through her, felt the covenant settle into her bones like recognition, like coming home to something she'd never known she'd lost. Valerian pulled her close, his face buried in her hair, his body shaking with emotion centuries in the making. You did it, he whispered. You impossible, magnificent woman. You did it, we did it. Isolde corrected, wrapping her arms around him. Together, Cressida launched herself at them both, her childish laughter bright against the ancient solemnity. They stood there in the hall of eternal night, a cursed king finally free, a mortal woman who became Thornblood liaison, and a child who had survived 3 years of torture to find safety again, holding each other while vampire lords looked on. Lady Seraphine's voice cut through the moment. Don't mistake this for forgiveness, Valerian. You have your throne back, but we will be watching. One slide toward the tyranny of old, One hint of the arrogance that got you cursed, and you'll have me to answer to. Isolde met Seraphine's amber eyes steadily. That's my job now. Official check on royal power. I take that responsibility seriously. Something that might have been respect flickered across Seraphine's face. See that you do, Thornblood. Lord Cassius descended from his throne, approaching the three of them with measured steps. The coronation will be held tomorrow at moonrise in the Shadow Court's throne room. The court will witness Valerian's restoration and the binding of the new covenant. His black ice eyes shifted to Isolde. And you, Isolde Ashford, will be bound by blood oath to your new position. Are you prepared for what that means? Tell me, Isolde said steadily. It means you're no longer fully mortal. The blood oath will change you not into vampire, but into something between. You'll age more slowly, live longer, exist partially in shadow. You'll never entirely belong to the mortal world again. He paused. This is your last chance to refuse. Isolde looked at Valerian, at the hope and fear warring in his silver eyes. Looked at Cressida, who watched her with such trust it made her heart ache. Thought of the blood roses growing in impossible gardens, the Shadow Court's eternal twilight, the soul bond that sang between her and an immortal king. I don't refuse, she said clearly. I accept. Bind me. Valerian's arms tightened around her. Are you certain? Once done, it cannot be undone. I'm certain. She smiled up at him. After all, someone has to make sure you don't become a tyrant again. Might as well be me. His laugh was half sob, pure relief and joy. Then tomorrow, he said softly, tomorrow we begin again, together, in the Hall of Eternal Night as ancient vampire lords bore witness. Isolde Ashford claimed her place between mortal and immortal worlds, and claimed the heart of a cursed king who finally learned that love, freely given, was stronger than any magic.